Support for this podcast comes from Progressive, America's #1 motorcycle insurer. Did you know riders who switch and save with Progressive save nearly $200 per year? That's a whole new pair of riding gloves and more. Quote today. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $197 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between October 2024 and September 2025. Potential savings will vary.
This podcast is sponsored by Pocket Hose.
Hi, I'm Richard Karn. Homeowners, listen up. Before Pocket Hose, garden hoses were heavy, bulky, hard to carry, and always kinking. Then Pocket Hose changed all that. It's the American invention that made watering lighter, easier, and smarter. And now, the world's #1 expanding hose has gone ballistic. Turn on the water and watch it grow from a compact hose into a full-length, powerful hose. Turn off the water and it shrinks right back down, making it easy to carry and easy to store. But now it's even better. With a tough ballistic-infused outer sleeve, a pocket pivot that helps reduce kinks at the spigot, thicker washers to help resist leaks, and UV protection to fight sun damage. And for a limited time, you'll get 2 free gifts, a 360-degree pocket pivot and a thumb drive nozzle. Just go to pockethose.com/podcast. That's pockethose.com/podcast for your 2 free gifts with purchase. pockethose.com/PODCAST.
This podcast is sponsored by Pocket Hose.
Hi, I'm Richard Karn. Homeowners, listen up. Before Pocket Hose, garden hoses were heavy, bulky, hard to carry, and always kinking. Then Pocket Hose changed all that. It's the American invention that made watering lighter, easier, and smarter. And now, the world's #1 expanding hose has gone ballistic. Turn on the water and watch it grow from a compact hose into a full-length, powerful hose. Turn off the water and it shrinks right back down, making it easy to carry and easy to store. But now it's even better. With a tough ballistic-infused outer sleeve, a pocket pivot that helps reduce kinks at the spigot, thicker washers to help resist leaks, and UV protection to fight sun damage. And for a limited time, you'll get 2 free gifts, a 360-degree pocket pivot and a thumb drive nozzle. Just go to pockethose.com/podcast. That's pockethose.com/podcast for your 2 free gifts with purchase. pockethose.com/PODCAST.
Yes, and that's a valid point because in a no-body homicide, you don't necessarily know where the scene is. So you've got to go to what might be possible scenes. Maybe if they disappeared before they were while they were going to work, or if they disappeared last time they were seen at home. So even on these possible scenes, I often tell the police, you have to look for what's missing, not just what's there. You know, is their cell phone missing? Are other things missing? Are pieces of furniture missing? Are pieces of carpet missing? That might be some indication of cleaning up. Those types of things. It is very important whenever you execute a search warrant to say, I'm not just looking for what's here, I'm looking for what's not here as well.
That's Tad DiBiase, a former federal homicide prosecutor who's investigated, prosecuted, and consulted on no-body homicide cases. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. The traditional narrative arc of a homicide case is that a crime occurs, the remains are collected, a funeral is held, and in the best circumstances, an arrest and prosecution commence. But there are some cases that are different, where there are no remains, there's no funeral, and there's no type of closure we believe occurs or should occur in homicide cases. Yet, still, in some of those cases, a prosecution does occur without a body, and often convictions are secured. For much of modern American history, if a perpetrator could make a body disappear and there were no witnesses, there was little chance they would ever be prosecuted for murder. Here or there were exceptions. Robert Leonard Ewing Scott was convicted in 1958 of the murder of his wife, Evelyn, after Los Angeles police found her eyeglasses, dentures, and some other personal items among buried ashes in the couple's Bel Air estate. In 1989, Ruby Morris disappeared in Cave Creek, Arizona, and prosecutors used analysis to determine there was so much blood in the house that she must not be alive, leading to the conviction of her husband, Garland Earl Morris. He was convicted in 1992 of murder. Federal prosecutors were able to get the conviction of Robert Peter Russell for murdering his estranged wife, Shirley Gibbs Russell, a U.S. Marine Corps captain who disappeared one day after picking up the final version of their separation agreement. Her body was never found, but his own notes included a 25-step plan that involved disposing of her body down one of hundreds of mine shafts. These cases, once rare, began to pick up steam in the late 1990s, and Tad DiBiase prosecuted Washington, D.C.'s second no-body homicide case and has gone on to consult law enforcement on forensic cases, domestic murders, and no-body homicides. He's the author of the book, No-Body Homicide Cases, Practical Guide to Investigating, Prosecuting, and Winning Cases Where the Victim is Missing. Today, we're going to discuss Tad's career, investigating and prosecuting no-body homicide cases, what can go right and what can go wrong in them, and what investigators and families need to know. So Tad, I just wanted to thank you for joining. I'm really excited to have you on today. In part, I heard your recent discussion on no-body homicides with Julia Cowley on her podcast, The Consult. Oh, and I don't even know if you know this, but that episode came right after I was on The Consult doing 4 episodes on Ashley Loring Heavy Runner's case. And, I'm just so impressed by them, and I was impressed by that conversation. So I reached out, and I'm glad you decided to come on.
Well, great. Thanks for having me, Jason. What's funny is when Julia asked me to be on The Consult, I had never heard the podcast before. I had heard of it, and I decided, let me go ahead and listen to a few episodes. And the episode that I first listened to was like the second or third of Ashley Heavy Runner, which, as we'll probably discuss, is a case I know very well. And so then I went back and listened to all 4 episodes and heard you on that episode. And so it's kind of funny that we were both hearing each other, although I was familiar with your work before this. But the fact that you were actually talking about a case that I knew pretty well. I've never officially worked on the Ashley Heavy Runner case, but a related case that we'll maybe also talk about, Jermaine Charlo, was like, oh my God, I know this case. So it's interesting that we've kind of come full circle of sort of hearing about one another, then hearing each other talk on the same podcast, which is a great podcast. As you know, Julia and her crew do a fantastic job on The Consult.
Yeah, they really are. They really are amazing. And it is truly a small world because as I've worked on Ashley's case, as you can imagine, even though it's on the other side of the Rocky Mountains, a number of the people who have worked on Jermaine's case, yes, are tangentially connected to it in different ways. And, I think it's interesting. I think a lot of people care about all sorts of cases like these, but it's a small universe of people who really dive in and get involved. And it's just neat to see that kind of work and all of those people who are out there. I was gonna start with asking about no-body homicides, but I want to ask another question first as I think about it. I'm curious what led you to law enforcement, becoming an attorney and becoming a prosecutor. I was recently having a conversation with a friend of mine. We were joking about SpaceX and the mechanic who became a millionaire. And he's like, I picked the wrong profession. And I was like, well, you did decide to go to law school, take on debt, become a public servant as a prosecutor, maybe not the best path. So I'll go ahead and start there and just tell me about your journey.
So I think I was always interested in crime and cops and robbers growing up. I have 3 brothers and a sister, And one of my brothers ended up becoming a cop in our hometown. Another brother became a firefighter. My sister became a teacher. My mother was a nurse. And my brother, my oldest brother, the black sheep of the family, went to work for IBM, which we called the family business because that's where my father worked.
Oh,
So
wow.
we have kind of we used to say it was always career day in the DiBiase household because you had a lawyer, you had a teacher, firefighter, police officer, business.
No shortage of people for the nieces and the nephews to bring to class.
Exactly. So I was always interested in that. I really truly wanted to become an FBI agent, but I have extremely poor vision, and that sort of knocked me out. You have to have it correctable to a certain thing. You have to be uncorrected a certain level, and I was very, very far from that. So I decided that, well, what's the next closest thing? Prosecutor. That's what I somehow settled on. And when I went to law school, I thought I was interested in being a prosecutor. And when I went through law school, I remained interested in being a prosecutor, even though there were other classes and things that interested me. I still felt like I wanted to become a prosecutor. In my last year, I had a class taught by two guys who were assistant U.S. attorneys in Brooklyn, and they were just about to try the John Gotti case, which,
Oh, yeah.
living in New York in the 80s, going to law school in Brooklyn, like John Gotti was everything. Like he was at the height of his powers. And so they did end up trying the case. John Gleason was the case. They finally got a conviction on Gotti. And I really, really looked up to both him and the other professor, Johnny Frank. And so Professor Gleason said, well, if you want to become, a federal prosecutor, you have to go to a law firm. And I was like, okay, I'm going to a law firm. So I went to a law firm first to take care of some of that debt that I had. But then after about 3.5 years, ended up joining the DC U.S. Attorney's Office, which, as you may know, being from here, is a unique office.
Yeah. Not like any other of the 92. Yeah.
The local prosecutor, plus it's also the regular federal prosecutor. So I spent most of my 12 years on the local side in what's called DC Superior Court, most of my time there as a homicide prosecutor. And it was while I was there that a colleague of mine gave me what appeared to be at the time a missing persons case, but as we know, subsequently turned out to be an actual no-body homicide case.
I'm curious from your perspective. It's always been interesting to me. One of the things I think's always interested me about missing persons case, or when I look at the stats and I look at the numbers, vast majority of people are found within a week of when they go missing, and then it gets, I think, after a month, it's near 80% or something like that, and then only 1% go longer than a year, at least in the data set that I was looking at recently.
Yes.
And how does it, so every missing persons case doesn't land on the desk of a prosecutor, but how do they end up on the desk of a prosecutor?
I think the thing that sets them apart is if you look at someone and you say, is this someone who's gone missing before? Does this fit the profile of who often is a missing person, which may be teenager, young adult? If it's something like only 12% of adult females are long-term missing or missing persons at all. So if you have an adult female, which my case was, it's very surprising that they would be sort of a runaway or a missing person. It's not your typical profile. So if you look at someone and you say, well, is this someone who would have a reason to run away? Do they have a bad marriage, or are they having financial difficulties, or do they have a drug issue? Are they in the sex workers industry? Those types of things. It's the absence of those that you start to say, this doesn't look like a normal missing persons case. That's when you start to say, I think this is a homicide because they left behind their phone. They left behind their wallet, their purse. They left behind their medicine that they need because they're diabetic. So when you start looking at all the circumstances of their disappearance, you say, this doesn't sketch out as a missing person. This sketches out as something that may be more serious than that. And one of the things when I talk and train police and prosecutors, I say, if you treat a case as a homicide and it turns out it's just a missing person and the person is found, great, you're no worse off. But if you treat it like a missing persons case and it turns out to be a homicide, you can be in a much more difficult situation because, as you've noted, maybe you've let a lot of time pass, maybe a few days, maybe a week, maybe a month. And the evidence you're going to get in a month is going to be significantly different than the evidence you might get the next day. Even things like cell tower records and cell phone records, text messages can be not kept by companies in as few as 30 days. So you really have to think about early on, how does this case present, knowing the vast majority of cases, as you said, Jason, are just missing persons. They're not homicides. But I think the longer you do this, you get a sense as to this doesn't seem like a missing persons case because the family and the friends and the coworkers are coming to us and saying, no. She's never missed work. She has kids at home who are young. There's no way she would have walked away. And that's when you start to get the sense of the differential between a missing persons case, which can still be serious, particularly if it's a young adult or a teenager, versus this is a 45-year-old woman who's never disappeared in her life. And most people don't walk away from their lives at 45 without some significant, either mental health trauma or drug issues or something like that.
Yeah. One interesting thing in there, just kind of jumping back to what you were saying, I think intellectually, it's really easy to think of things like look for signs of foul play, like things that are additive, right? There's blood somewhere or there's a bad relationship. But I thought it was really interesting because what you were really saying is what's missing, sort of what's subtracted, like the things that aren't there.
Yes.
These certain signs are probably greater indicators or they're more likely to present themselves as indicators. And I think that's hard intellectually to think of because we're used to thinking of, what evidence is here as opposed to what factors aren't here.
Yes, and that's a valid point because in a no-body homicide, you don't necessarily know where the scene is. So you've got to go to what might be possible scenes. Maybe if they disappeared while they were going to work, or if they disappeared last time they were seen at home. So even on these possible scenes, I often tell the police, you have to look for what's missing, not just what's there. What is their cell phone missing? Are other things missing? Are pieces of furniture missing? Are pieces of carpet missing? That might be some indication of cleaning up. Those types of things. It is very important whenever you execute a search warrant to say, I'm not just looking for what's here, I'm looking for what's not here as well.
Yeah, like for me, and I see how that actually bears out in some of the cases that, I've explored in depth. I think about a case like Ashley's, or even, I don't know if you're familiar with the Lewis Clark Valley serial killer case, which is one in Lewiston, Idaho. And it's a kind of interesting one because one of the things that happened in the late 1970s, a girl goes missing in a town during a sort of fair. Years later, 4 people go missing from a theater in downtown Lewiston, Idaho, which is not far from Asotin, Washington, where the first girl went missing. And, there were 3 women we've got 3 women who have disappeared. At the theater, of the 3 people who disappeared, 1 was a man, 2 were a woman. For years, they thought, okay, maybe that man who disappeared had killed the women. Years later, they found out that the neighbor of the first girl who disappeared in the 1970s was also the janitor at the theater and was there that night. But one of the things that caused them in that case to say, hey, maybe this guy, Stephen Parasol was his name, maybe the reason why Stephen, the guy who went missing, was not a part of it, it was the absence of things, the absence of him, going to school, the absence of him taking money out of his bank account, the absence of him showing up at these things that they knew were really important to him. And that's what made them look in another direction away from him. And then Ashley's case, very similar thing. For her sister Kimberly, it was instantly obvious to her. Kimberly was coming back from a trip to Morocco.
Yep.
Ashley was consistently and constantly in contact with her, and not hearing from her once she arrived instantly told the family there's something wrong. She wasn't in touch with her mom, her grandma. But it took a month for the BIA to really take it seriously. It was until they, about 4 weeks later, they got a tip that a man had been seen chasing a woman on a road in the area, and the woman sort of fit the description of Ashley, and the BIA then really got engaged in searching. But still, it took them 8 months to bring the FBI in. And I often think in that case, the family instantly got it because they knew the victim's patterns. But if we knew in the first week, right, if the law enforcement knew in the first week the things that were known in the 6th week, I think this case would probably be closed by now.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes such a difference because you give people time to clean up. You give time for people to get rid of evidence, to come up with a story, to cover their tracks, to move a body if they've placed it somewhere. It's just 6 weeks is a lot of time when you say 6 weeks versus 2 days or a week even. And people's memories are fresher, even in that real short period of time. It just makes a tremendous impact to know early on what's happening versus some significant period of time later.
What was it that brought you to even sort of thinking about, or I think spending a lot of time on No-Body Homicides? I knew you talked about prosecuting the second No-Body Homicide case in DC. Was that what it was?
I think it was. To me, I was always interested in being a homicide prosecutor once I sort of learned what being, a prosecutor was, because to me, it was the ultimate crime. And I felt like if that's the ultimate crime, a no body is the ultimate murder because there's so much information that you don't have. And when I started to look into trying to figure out how to try my DC case, I realized there wasn't a whole lot of information out there about how to try a no-body murder case. There were no books. It was hard to find cases. And a colleague of mine who had investigated a no-body murder case but didn't try it had given me a legal memorandum one of his law clerks had written that had like maybe 40 or 50 cases. And I remember thinking, oh, that seems like a lot. So I started reading those cases, looking at them and sort of seeing what type of evidence they had. And then I started building on that list myself because I wanted to know, well, what are all the cases? What are cases in Maryland and Virginia? Their law is kind of similar to ours, particularly in DC. A lot of our common law came from Maryland. And it just kind of grew from there. I definitely am someone who's very numerically focused. I like to count things until I stopped running a couple of years ago. I wrote down every mile I ever ran from 7th grade on. So I'm very good at counting things and keeping track in an obsessive way. So I started doing that.
Sounds like you found a good outlet.
Yeah, I think so. I think it really, because I did feel like, well, this could be helpful because other prosecutors probably wonder how many cases there are. And so first I did it anonymously when I still worked at DOJ. I put it up on a Word table, which it still is to this day, which everyone thinks is ridiculous. And I still keep it as a Word table. There's this thing called Excel, I guess. I don't know.
That they invented?
Yeah, I want to make sure it doesn't go under. I want to see if that Excel has some staying power. And so I started doing that, did it anonymously. When I left DOJ, I kind of came out in the open. And once I came out, I got a lot of calls from police and prosecutors, from press, from people asking questions. How do you try these cases? How do you do these cases? And at that point, I decided, well, let me write a book about it because I think it would be helpful. And I do think in a small way, it's been helpful to folks. A number of times I've had detectives tell me, hey, I got your book. I read it. It was really helpful. I was, able to look at other cases from our state because in the book, and now there's a second edition that came out in 2024. They were able to find cases for their state, and it's all 50 states now where there have been successful cases. And I felt like that's been helpful for people to understand, yes, these cases are very rare, but they're not unheard of. I've found a total of about 650 cases in the United States that have gone to trial since the early 1800s. So while they remain an incredibly small percentage of all murder trials in the United States, let alone all murder cases, they're not so rare that people are, befuddled or don't know how to do them. The other interesting number, I think, is of those 650 cases, more than 50% have been tried since the year 2000. So in the last 26, 27 years, we've tried 325 cases, which is pretty incredible due to the forensic advances. But I also think due to people understanding, prosecutors in particular, hey, I can make these cases. These are cases that can be tried. And I like to think I hopefully played a small part in that, of people saying, oh God, 600 cases, that's a lot more than I thought. I mean, if you had told me when I started this 20 years ago that there'd be 600 cases, I would have been like, no way. That just seems like a huge number to me. And that number is growing, month by month. There's a couple cases I'm tracking now that are, in trial and things like that. So I think that's been gratifying to me to have seen this grow over 20 years in terms of the number of cases prosecutors are becoming more comfortable bringing.
Yeah, I certainly see that. I remember back in 1998, I was in New York and, covered a little bit of the disappearance of Irene Silverman, who's a New York socialite who,
She
really lovely.
Rocks candy or something like that. Was that her fortune?
Yes. Yep. That's where it came from.
Yep.
And, it was really interesting. So she disappeared. It was clear she had staff and she had other people. So it was clear something was very wrong. And ultimately, at the end of the year, they arrested Kenneth Kimes and his mom, Sante Kimes, on fraudulent check charges and some other things related to her. And, it was very clear they suspected them in the homicide. And I remember people saying to me at the time, well, they're going to have to find her body to charge them with murder. And they went ahead and charged them with murder. And I was like, well, this is never going to result in a conviction. And they did.
Right.
And I was like baffled.
Right.
I was just totally baffled by the idea of and I think the thing for me is, how do you even sell the story of, how do you even prove that the person's dead? And then how do you prove from there that they died by a criminal act? And then how do you prove from there that this person's responsible? So, I think in my mind, I had a hard time wrapping around, to your point of studying all those cases, how a prosecutor tells that story. And that, I'm not sure, are those the kind of key elements legally that you have to prove?
Absolutely, because the challenge in a no-body murder case is you have two things to prove that you've pointed out. I've condensed your first one and two into one, which is that the person is indeed not missing but murdered, and then two, that guy sitting over in the defendant's chair is the one who did it. Ordinarily, in a normal homicide, you don't have to prove number one, right? You have the medical examiner come forward and say, yep, I saw the body, they were dead, this is what happened to them, they were shot, they were poisoned, they were strangled. In a no body, you have to prove that the person is actually dead. And the challenge in that is because you're going to use both positive and negative evidence. And you touched on this earlier, Jason. The negative evidence is, what evidence do we have of the person not being alive? Well, they never contacted their family. No one's ever seen them. Their disability check or Social Security check that was in there is automatically deposited in their bank account every month. They've never touched that. All of those things are things that a prosecutor uses to show this is why we know this person is not just missing, because someone going missing who ran away, they're not going to leave $3,000 in their bank account. That's not going to happen. They're not going to leave their phone behind. They're not going to leave their wallet behind. And then on top of that, you layer in whatever positive affirmative evidence you have, such as I can show that this defendant was cleaning up. I can show that this defendant and the missing person had a very volatile relationship. They had a fight. They had numerous fights. Maybe the defendant was arrested for, domestically assaulting her at some point. All of those things combined together go to show a jury this is what happened. And, as prosecutors, we're never required to prove motive in order to prove a murder. In a no-body murder case, though, you really do have to prove the motive, because you have to give the jury a story that they will understand and recognize from their life experience as to this is why this happened, because I don't have a body. I can't prove to them 100% that this is a murder. I can't bring out the autopsy photos. I can't bring out the family that said, yes, we buried her. Here's where she is. Here's the gravestone, all of that. So I have to be able to tell a coherent story that matches the juror's life experience to say, oh yeah, I get it. They were getting divorced. They were having a child custody battle, or she was moving on with another man and he didn't like it, or they were business partners and this business was falling apart. And therefore, this guy got rid of this guy because whatever reason, it was going to, take care of his business problems somehow. So by doing that, you cure some of the missing stuff by being able to show motive. And of course, you have to show opportunity and all that stuff. But it is, in a no-body murder case, motive becomes so much more important than it might be ordinarily in a what I call kind of run-of-the-mill homicide.
Yeah, because I imagine all prosecution of something like murder is about, in many ways, storytelling.
Yes.
But when you don't have a body, that storytelling becomes way more important because you're jumping multiple hurdles.
Yes.
That normally the medical examiner, right? You put somebody on for proof of life, you put somebody on for proof of death, and you've already jumped through those hurdles. I'm curious about one thing. Obviously, to convict the defendant, you need to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. Is that the same standard for the proof of, or that the likelihood that the person died? Or is it a clear and convincing standard, or more likely than not?
You're right. It's proof beyond a reasonable doubt for all aspects.
Oh, wow.
There may be lesser burdens for keeping out certain defense evidence and probably certain prosecutors' evidence as well. But the thing I'm familiar with is sometimes you have what I euphemistically call killer X, where the defense wants to argue some specific other person may have done it. You don't always see that, or you probably don't often see that in a no-body murder case, because the defense is pretty obvious. Like, we don't even know if she's dead. How do we know this is even a murder case? But sometimes you have people point to other people who did it, and in order to keep that evidence out, the court will sometimes have a lesser standard like clear and convincing. They'll do all of this outside the presence of the jury, and the judge will ultimately say, yeah, defense, you can't put that in. You don't have clear and convincing evidence that it may be that person. But that exception aside, it's always the government's burden to prove beyond a reasonable doubt all elements of the case. And one of the elements, of course, is, was there a murder? So we do have to prove that. I say we, I'm not a prosecutor anymore, but when I work with police and prosecutors, you do have to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt as well.
So you had mentioned those 300 cases that have occurred since about 2000, was it 350? How often are they successful?
87% of no-body murder cases that have gone to trial are successful, which of course seems crazy, just what we've been talking about, right? Like how difficult this is. And I think...
But it makes me think that there are probably 2,000 that the police probably believe are
Correct. Yep.
Yeah.
And that's the valid point, Jason, is a prosecutor is not going to take a weak no-body murder case to trial because the defense is so obvious. And they only, most murder cases, the conviction rate's about 71%. So it's still very high, but it's not as high as 87%, which is a significant increase. And I think, one, prosecutors don't take weak missing person cases to trial. Two, about 54% of no-body murder cases are domestic cases. So husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, parent, child. And so in those cases, the suspect is pretty obvious, right? If you have a woman who goes missing and she has an ex-husband and she doesn't have a lot of other things in her life that might cause her to be murdered, what does everyone say? Well, the husband probably did it. Well, lots of times that's true. And so when you start off with kind of an obvious suspect, the police and the prosecutors are able to paint that picture, show that story that says, this is why this guy probably did it, or did it beyond, guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, because it makes sense. It resonates with people like, oh yeah, jilted lover, pissed off husband, ex-boyfriend, all of those things are things that I think people recognize, as well as I think the additions today of electronic evidence and electronic trails that we all leave behind. We all leave so much more evidence behind
Clues.
than we did 20 years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, you and I each have cell phones. If, one of us were to disappear, they would see that, the last communications we had with each other was over email or maybe text or whatever. And that right there is important information. And that type of evidence, I think, also drives up the high conviction rate, because when you have that powerful evidence, it makes a prosecutor more comfortable that, hey, I can get a conviction in this case. Whereas 30 years ago, we didn't really have this type of evidence.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. And one of the things too about domestics, or when people are infrequent, your suspect and your victim are in frequent contact, you also have the beauty of post-offense behavior.
Absolutely.
And you can track the way the person's behavior changed compared to other people who are close to them. And I feel like people give themselves up with that very often.
No, it's really true. One of the things that I discovered when I was writing the book the first time was I tried to look for things what were unique to no-body murder cases versus even regular, what I call run-of-the-mill murder cases. And one of the things you see almost always in a domestic case is the suspect moves on way too quickly. It may mean he moves on to a new girlfriend, which in my no-body murder case happened 3 days after he killed her. He was already shacking up and ultimately living with someone who he had gotten in a car accident with, and then ended up with her that quickly when she was, supposedly just missing for 3 days. You can see sometimes husbands will throw out stuff belonging to their wife, like, oh, she doesn't need these clothes. She's only been gone a week and you're tossing out her clothes. They may change things in the house. They may cover things up, paint, move furniture, remove furniture. All of those things are an indication of post-murder behavior that are really critical, because like you said, it enables people to draw conclusions. If you're doing this is somehow related to what happened before.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I'm wondering from your perspective, because you've probably talked to a lot of law enforcement while you were working as a prosecutor and then afterwards about these kinds of situations. Are there any sort of lingering misconceptions prosecutors, investigators, or others have about these kinds of cases? I just think you mentioned Jermaine's story. I've got Ashley's story, that I've spent a lot of time on, and I've gotten to know some of the agents who have worked on it. There's a lot of trepidation. There's a lot of, I think for a lot of these folks, a lot of hope we'll find a body. And they feel like that's going to be a really, really important part of it. But for prosecutors, for for investigators, some of them who may be listening right now.
I hope so.
Any advice?
So I would say, I think there's two things. One is that even though I've spent the last 20 years talking about how to try a case without a body, it's always better to have the body. And what that means is if you have a chance of finding the missing person's body, you should take it and you should make sure that you can show all of the searches that you've done, that you have left no stone unturned. And one of the other things I learned in these cases is that a body is often disposed of in a location familiar to the defendant. Almost always, when we were able to determine where the body was disposed of, it's in a location familiar to the defendant. And that needs to be leveraged in the searches for these bodies. And so I think sometimes early on, when you're not that far into the case, people give up on searching. And I don't think you should do that. But by the same token, on the flip side, when you're that many years later and it is unlikely you're going to find a body, and that time can vary from location to location. A body in Arizona or Florida is going to break down much faster than a body in upper, Washington State or certainly Alaska. I would not spend much time at that point looking for a body because it doesn't do you many favors. I think the other thing,
But to your point, it does do you one, right? Which is that you can someday say to a jury, we looked at all of these places.
yes, but that becomes diminishing returns.
Right.
If you're
Over
saying,
time.
I'm going to spend time looking 10 years later.
Yeah.
Your time is better spent elsewhere. The second thing I think is something that I think law enforcement overlooks all the time, which are provable lies told by the suspect. In law enforcement, we are so used to people lying to us all the time. Like, it's not a big deal. Like, we know, oh, okay, this guy's lying. How many drinks did you have tonight, sir? Oh, I had one, and they had 5 or 7 or whatever. That we get inured to it. And in a no-body murder case, particularly a domestic case, if you have someone who tells a lie about their missing wife or their missing ex-wife or girlfriend, that is very damning because jurors aren't as jaded as the rest of us are, journalists included, right? People lie all the time. Jurors, though, say, well, wait a second. If my loved one went missing, I wouldn't lie about anything. I would tell the truth, even if it was, maybe didn't reflect too well on me, because it's more important to find the person than for me to look good or not look, guilty. And I think we get these lies that we can prove. And the classic one is a suspect will tell the police one thing about what happened or where he thinks she is, and then tell a friend or a neighbor or a family member a completely different story. Or we'll say, oh yeah, she's down in North Carolina with her family. She's done this before. Completely different story. Getting that story in front of a jury is very damning because people, number one, don't know why someone would say something different. And 2, it's very hard for the defendant to explain that difference unless they take the stand, which as a prosecutor, you always want your defendant to take the stand.
It's your dream, right?
Right. Please take the stand. And so I think those are 2 things that I think I spend some time convincing prosecutors that this is, these are some misconceptions that people have. It used to be years ago, the misconception was, as you noted, your initial thought with the case in New York, Silverman, right?
Silverman. Yep.
That not having a body means you don't have a case. And that's not true. And luckily now, I think it's the very, very rare prosecutor who says that. Most prosecutors know, no, you can make a case without a body. And, the cases are in my book. They're summarized. They're listed out by state. So no one should make that argument anymore. But certainly 10 years ago, I heard folks making that argument. Oh, I'm not going to try this case unless I get a body, which always infuriates me. You have to judge the case on the evidence. I'm not saying every missing persons case is a triable homicide case. The vast majority are not. But I'm saying that you can't use that as an excuse I'm not going to try it simply because I don't have a body. That's not a valid excuse not to try a case.
Yeah, no. And I could see, to your point, that element of being jaded. I think about going into my doctor's office, and, I have to preface with my doctor because I think it's very similar. When I say that I don't drink, but, but that, when I say I only had one drink or that I only smoke one cigarette a day or whatever, I really actually do mean that. And I think, cops, detectives, prosecutors are so used to not just suspects lying to them, but witnesses.
Yep.
Everybody has something they would much rather not be completely open about. Frankly, I think it's the same thing with lawyers. My lawyer jokes with me. She's like, "You're the only client who tells me all of it." I'm like, might as well get it out there, because if I can't trust you, can't trust anyone.
It's true. It's true.
And I could see how that would sort of jade you to, or you'd miss the way that an everyday person would even think about it. And I think it's probably even true. I can think of cases where people have said things like, "Oh, I was out searching for that person. I really, am very interested. This is the last place I saw them." Then they say something completely different to a friend and then someone else. And, that sort of makes you think, like, either this person is a habitual liar or they're trying to hide something. I think this is a great spot to stop for today. And Tad, we can pick it up again in the next episode. In the meantime, I want to thank all our Patreon members. It's through your help we are able to bring you the podcast. And if you'd like to join us for more discussions with me and other listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with our guests, live conversations with other listeners, you can also join us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. I'm Jason Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. We'll see you guys all again.